Hey everyone, it's Jay's Painting in the Earth Sky Art Studios, and today I want to talk about oil paints. Okay, so what are oil paints? Well, basically they are a pigment and a carrier. Pigments are crushed minerals, and the carrier is usually linseed oil, although there are some oil paints that have additives to speed drying or change the finish at the end. There are some oils that actually have water-soluble additives to them, so you can clean up with water, but we're not going to talk about those today. We'll talk about just your basic oil paints. So, basic history of oils. The paints are basically crushed minerals and linseed oil. What's linseed oil? Well, it's flax oil. Flax, little grain that you can crush up, get oil from, and you can get it in health food stores, but you can also get it in oil paint. Don't recommend mixing the two. Fun fact, linoleum was originally made from ground cork and linseed oil, hence the linoleum. So, how do oil paints work? Well, as we talked about, the pigments are put into the carrier of the linseed oil, and that gives you the nice pasty thing that you use to paint with. But how do they dry? There's a difference between drying and curing. When you use watercolors or acrylics, that's drying, because basically what happens is the water in those paints evaporates into the air. Oil paints are very different than that, though. They actually cure via a process called polymerization, or otherwise known as plasticization. What happens is the linseed oils have a bunch of polymers in them, and they interact with the air, specifically the oxygen in the air. And what happens is that when it's in contact with the air, they actually form tighter bonds and start to harden into basically a bioplastic. The hardening happens from the outside in. So the thicker your oil paints are, the longer it takes to dry. And even fairly thin oil paints can take weeks to months to dry. And in fact, the drying process never really ends. And if you've got really thick paint, it can take hundreds of years for the polymerization to actually make its way into the thickest parts of your painting. So that's something to really keep in mind. Also important to remember that if you're going to varnish your finished painting, you've got to wait at least 6 months, and better to wait a year before you do that when you're painting with oil paints, because varnish will stop that polymerization process and your piece will never dry. So how long will oil paints keep in their tubes? Well, depends. If you are better than I am and you keep the lids on all the time, they can last a long time. I'm pretty lazy about that. So it can be a short period of time or a pretty long period of time. I have a tube here of Gamblin Golden Ochre. It's probably a year old. It's hard and dry. Can't really even use it anymore. This Winton oil color here, Cadmium Lemon, it's probably 35 years old. The top has been sealed up just by drying, and it's as good as the day it was bought. So they can last a really long time, but it really varies by brand, and it also varies by pigment too. Some pigments are more susceptible to drying. That also includes drying on your palette. I've got some colors on my palette that can sit there for 2 or 3 weeks uncovered and just sitting there, and they'll be fine. I have other colors that overnight they'll be dry enough that they'll have a skin over top of them, and you can't really use them very well. So again, pretty variable, but it's good to know that as long as you keep them sealed up, they should last a long time. So how do you choose an oil paint? I think the only way to really do it is to just try some different brands. I am a firm believer in making sure that you're using paints that are not just from one brand, because you're going to find pigments from specific brands that you really like, some that you really don't like, and the only way to do it is just try them out. I use 6 different brands of paint when I paint. Some of them are fairly inexpensive and some of them are quite expensive, but I really like some of the pigments and some of their consistency from the cheaper brands as compared to exactly the same color and the most expensive brands I buy, and vice versa. There's colors that I just can't get in the cheaper brands that you can only get in the expensive ones. Other thing is that there are, even though they're named colors, you've got a cadmium red medium or something like that, every single pigment recipe from different brands is going to be different. So you may find that you like one better than the other from a specific brand. And you may in fact find that you like both of them from different brands, but they're different colors. So it's absolutely fine to mix and match with your brands, and I really encourage it. I find that the high-end brand that I use, I don't like the real bright yellows that they've got because the consistency is way too thick and they don't work for me. So I actually use a mid-range brand for the yellows that I really like. So the only way to figure that out is just to buy some and try it out. And it's not the cheapest way to do it, but I think it's a really good idea. One of the things you will want to do is avoid, especially when you're starting out, you want to avoid the cheapest brands and probably the most expensive brands because you won't know what you're looking for. So start out with some medium and mid-range brands and pick a few of the basic colors. You don't need a whole bunch of colors because you can remember you don't need to buy a green if you've got a blue and a yellow, because you can make green out of that, or at least a lot of different greens. So it's good to start out with maybe 10 different colors when you're starting. You don't have to buy 20 or 30 different kinds of paint. I find when I'm working, I have maybe 20 different pigments that I use, but depending on the piece, sometimes I'll only use 6 or 7. So you don't need to get too much when you're starting out, but definitely don't go with the cheap stuff. The cheap stuff is going to be super frustrating. It's thin, it's mostly carrier, mostly linseed oil or other additives, and the pigments are going to be really weak and you're going to see brush strokes and it's going to be really annoying. So don't buy the cheapest stuff. One thing you want to keep in mind, a bit of a safety tip here, linseed oil is very prone to spontaneous combustion. So you do have to be really careful with your rags that you use. If you're getting a lot of oil paints onto your rags, you want to be able to dispose of them properly, which means don't pile them up in a garbage can or something. The best thing to do is lay them out to dry for a week or two and then take them directly out in the trash. Don't pile them up, just keep them flat till they're dry and get rid of them. You don't want to have a sudden unexplained fire. I'm going to do a whole different video on safety, but I think that's important to put into this video here too. So just keep that in mind. And with that, I think that's an overview that can get you on your way with oil paints. And if you like this video, give it a like and subscribe, and you could even click the bell if you want to be notified for when I post more videos. I'm going to be doing things on brushes, canvases, the safety video I just talked about. So subscribe and make sure you don't miss it. Till next time.